Italy, a country known for its rich cultural heritage, exquisite cuisine, and stunning architecture. But behind this beautiful facade, there's been a darker side to life for centuries: organized crime. Despite ongoing efforts by the government, the Mafia remained one of the most powerful criminal forces in Europe for a long time. And to this day, some of the biggest criminal organizations are still based in Italy. But how and why did these criminal groups emerge? What exactly is the Mafia? Which infamous Mafia clan became the very symbol of Italian organized crime? And why were several movies made about them, ones that became hits far beyond sunny Italy? Let's start with this. The Mafia in Italy isn't just the biggest criminal organization in the world, it's also the oldest. So, where did the word Mafia come from? There are a few different theories about the origin of the term and the secret societies it describes. Here are some of the most interesting. The first theory, though less popular, is still worth mentioning. It dates back to the time when Sicily was under Arab rule, around the 9th to 10th centuries. Back then, local Sicilians tried to preserve their national identity and culture by escaping to the mountains to hide from their occupiers. In these remote areas, they formed secret groups to resist the Arabs. Wealthy Sicilian families who had good relations with the Arab authorities often helped fund and support these groups. According to this version, the word mafia comes from an old Arabic word meaning safe haven. The second theory takes us to the late 13th century, when the people of Sicily rose up against French occupiers in what became known as the Sicilian Vespers. Most of the French were killed or driven out. During that time, a local slogan emerged: Morte alla Francia, Italia anela. Death to France, Italy longs for freedom. The acronym from the first letters of that slogan spells Mafia. The word gained wider recognition in 1863 when a play called The Mafiosi of the Vicariate by Giuseppe Risotto was staged at the Palermo Theater. By then, groups that shared traits typical of organized crime had already begun forming. So, what made them stand out? We'll get to that soon. But first, why did the Mafia emerge, and what was its original purpose? According to one widely accepted theory, which places it closer to our time, the Mafia in Sicily started forming in the late 19th century, with some surprisingly noble goals at first. These early Mafia groups claimed to protect peasants from landowners' abuses, pirates, and general lawlessness. Some even romanticized them as patriotic rebels fighting against Napoleon's forces and defending Italian freedom. Of course, each of these stories has its supporters and critics. Which version you believe is up to you. But let's keep going. No matter how it started, criminal organizations in Italy really began to take shape in the 1800s, particularly in the regions of Sicily, Calabria, Campania, and Apulia. Soon, mafia groups in the south started uniting against the northern part of the country. That's because the north and south were worlds apart in terms of development. While the north was adopting a modern capitalist economy run by the state, the south remained rural, deeply religious, and mostly controlled by landowners who could easily bribe the police. The Mafia quickly filled the power vacuum. They offered protection to local farmers, helped settle land disputes, and even tracked down stolen livestock, all for a fee. Southern Italians often distrusted the official police and considered Mafia mediation more effective. When Italy was eventually unified, Southerners resisted for about a decade through guerrilla warfare. This resistance only helped the underground groups grow stronger. Eventually, Southerners gave in to national unification, but the criminal networks didn't go away. They simply evolved into highly organized structures with their own laws and codes. By the end of the 19th century, the Italian government's weak presence in some regions allowed these groups to become powerful, almost like a parallel state. So what did all these mafia clans have in common? What was at the heart of their organization? First off, every mafia member had to be Catholic. The leaders, or mafiosi, were not only regular churchgoers, but often donated large sums of money to support religious causes. Second, they all followed a strict code called omerta, a set of unwritten rules that governed behavior, loyalty, and silence. But where did omerta come from, and how did it help the Mafia survive? Let's go back in time again. In the mid-15th century, a secret Spanish religious order called La Garduna emerged. Closely tied to the Inquisition, which at the time was practically part of the government, the Garduna acted as an underground network that helped root out Muslims, Jews, heretics, or anyone the authorities didn't like. At some point, 3 monk brothers from the Garduna, Carcagnoso, Mastroso, and Osso, ended up in southern Italy, which was under Spanish control. They were on a personal mission to track down the man who had assaulted their sister and avenge her honor. They eventually caught and punished the man. But despite their noble goal and church affiliation, the brothers were sentenced to 30 years in prison. While behind bars, they created their own rulebook, a code of honor, silence, and mutual protection. They called it omerta, and centuries later, the Mafia adopted it as its core doctrine. It became the backbone of how members behaved, how loyalty was enforced, and why breaking the silence could cost you your life. What is this code of conduct? What rules were written into it? And how did the 3 brothers leave their mark on Italy's history? Let's talk about omerta. The core rule of this code is the absolute ban on members of criminal organizations cooperating with the government. No talking to investigators or authorities, even during a crime investigation. In fact, any interaction with state institutions is strictly forbidden. Omerta demands total silence. Never report or reveal any plans of an upcoming crime. Another key rule: total and unquestioning obedience to the head of the group. Leadership is passed down following the tradition of family succession because the Mafia is treated like a family, with each relative having a specific role. To ensure secrecy, Mafia bosses often surrounded themselves with blood relatives who, under the rules, were forbidden from testifying against family members. Any internal conflicts or grievances had to be settled within the group. No police, no courts. Betrayal was punishable by death. And betrayal didn't just mean active wrongdoing. Even inaction that harmed the group could be fatal. Another strict rule: never target the relatives of someone who crossed the Mafia. Leaving the Mafia was only allowed upon death. These weren't the only rules of omerta, of course. There were many more, and in the early days, they were strictly followed. So what happened to the 3 monk brothers? After being released from prison, they went their separate ways and started their own groups, their own families. Carcagnoso settled in Naples and founded the Camorra. Mastroso went to Calabria and formed the 'Ndrangheta, and also returned to Sicily, where he established the most famous Mafia clan of all, Cosa Nostra. We'll get back to that one later. Interestingly, joining the Mafia wasn't as simple as showing up. The brothers created an initiation ritual, something like a knighting ceremony. Some historians believe this ritual was a later invention by Mafia descendants, meant to give criminal groups a sense of mystique and false honor. They argue the code of honor was just a cover for all kinds of fraud and violence. Either way, from the late 15th century onward, Mafia groups would appear and disappear, depending on the political climate and historical events, until the 19th century, when everything changed. How did this new era reshape the Mafia's life? What new rules defined group relationships? The modern age brought sweeping changes across global society, from international trade and education to the rise of capitalism and colonial empires. People's everyday lives were transforming, and of course the Mafia evolved too. Their semi-legal income streams grew, and more people wanted in on the action. These once secretive groups began to transform into well-organized criminal networks. But with growth came a need for more funding. Mafia bosses started placing heavy demands on their backers, and anyone who refused to pay risked not only their own life, but also the safety of their loved ones. Mafia intimidation tactics became more aggressive: extortion, threats, even murder. But going after a mafia boss, not so easy. First, because of omerta, anyone who broke the silence was as good as dead. Second, the mafia developed a rigid internal hierarchy made up of clans, like a corporate pyramid. Let's picture it like a staircase. At the very top is the boss of bosses, the ultimate leader who runs the ruling council. Below him is the don, or boss, of an individual clan. Then comes his underboss and consigliere, advisor. Beneath them are the soldiers, groups of 10 to 20 men known as mafia cells or crews. Each clan can have several of these units, each headed by a capodicina, captain. Mafia crews rarely interact with each other. The foot soldiers don't even know who the captains or other cell members are. And at the very bottom are associates, people who support the mafia but aren't Italian, like bankers, lawyers, corrupt officials, or dirty cops. So, what does the term family really mean in this context? A family includes all the soldiers, cells, captains, dons, and their wives, children, and extended relatives. This isn't just a gang, it's a tightly structured criminal empire. Now it's clear why authorities struggle to bring the mafia down. Neither the don nor the boss ever deals directly with captains or enforcers. Soldiers never see the people they're working for. And thanks to the code of silence, every member knows breaking omerta means death. That's when another mafia law kicks in: vendetta, blood, revenge. And the boss? He stays far removed from the violence. On paper, he doesn't commit any crimes, and proving otherwise is almost impossible. That's why the arrest of any mafia don was, and still is, global headline news. So which Italian mafia group would go on to spread its wings and become nearly unbeatable? Who supported it, and how did it come to play a key role in Italian politics? Let's move into the mid-19th century. Shortly after the unification of Italy, an old and almost forgotten organization founded in the Middle Ages by Brother Osso began to regain power on the island of Sicily. That organization was Cosa Nostra, which in Sicilian means our thing. Cosa Nostra would go on to become the most infamous of all the Italian mafia groups. Its reputation would be shaped not just by its crimes, but also by the countless books, films, and high-profile trials it inspired, many of which we'll return to later. At the time, government authority in southern Italy was weak. Laws were barely enforced, and people, especially landowners, began turning to armed groups for protection. These groups first called themselves men of honor, and then started using a word that had nearly faded from memory: mafia. In the beginning, the mafia portrayed itself as a defender of the poor and oppressed, but that didn't last long. Why protect poor farmers when there's no money in it? It made more sense to offer protection to those who could pay. So the mafia shifted its focus to wealthy landowners and big estate holders. Even then, their version of protection often came with extortion, threats, and even murder. Over time, Cosa Nostra transformed into a powerful, secretive organization with its own laws, code of honor, and rigid hierarchy. Eventually, the island of Sicily wasn't big enough for such a massive operation. Like the arms of a giant octopus, the mafia began spreading across Italy, and soon became a major international criminal syndicate. The octopus metaphor isn't accidental, and you'll soon understand why. Let's take a closer look at how this organization gradually expanded its influence. Cosa Nostra was made up of several large family clans. Each clan followed a strict internal structure with clearly defined roles from the bottom all the way to the top. At the top stood the godfather, always surrounded by loyal advisors and bodyguards. Soon, each clan took control of its own territory, sometimes a few towns, sometimes an entire province. Of course, the mafia never openly participated in public affairs. If there were any documents linking them to politics, they were kept well out of sight. So proving their political role was next to impossible. Rumors about mafia influence circulated throughout Italy, and many of them were likely exaggerated, possibly even spread by the Mafia itself to build its image of power. But one thing is clear. After the national elections of 1912, the Mafia began actively inserting itself into urban life and eventually into national politics, placing its own people into key government positions. Step by step, the Sicilian Mafia spread its influence across nearly all of Italy, reaching even the elite political circles of Rome. But then, something happened that would weaken the grip of organized crime. How did Cosa Nostra come close to being wiped out? Who dared to insult Mussolini, and how did he strike back? Where did the Mafia bosses flee? In the early 20th century, the Mafia was at its peak, especially in Sicily. On the island, the government existed in name only. Real power lay in the hands of Mafia clans, who handled justice, controlled politics and the economy, and even imposed taxes. Sicilians didn't complain. The Mafia had effectively replaced the state. And who else could they turn to when the police and officials were powerless? Then came the rise of fascism, led by Benito Mussolini. He dreamed of building a totalitarian regime where citizens would follow orders without question. To achieve this, he needed total control, and so he declared himself Il Duce, the supreme leader, tolerating no rivals. So naturally, he couldn't allow the Mafia, a shadow power, to challenge his authority. And that's exactly what happened. Want to know how Mussolini got insulted? Here's the story. In 1924, Mussolini paid an official visit to Sicily. As prime minister, he arrived with a heavy security detail, but Don Ciccio, the local Mafia boss, who was also the mayor of the town of Piana degli Albanesi, saw this as an insult. He tried to explain that in Sicily, safety was under his personal protection, and there was no need for Mussolini's guards. But Mussolini saw this as a direct challenge. How could the head of the Italian nation accept that he wasn't the top authority on Italian soil? He refused the offer, and Don Ciccio made his move. When Mussolini stepped out onto the balcony of the town hall to give a speech, there was no crowd. Maybe 20 people showed up, most of them beggars, vendors, or cripples. Mussolini instantly understood. Someone had ordered the townspeople to stay away, a humiliating display of who really ruled Sicily. His revenge came quickly. Back in Rome, Mussolini launched a brutal campaign to wipe out the Mafia. He vowed to restore government control over the island at any cost. If the current laws don't allow it, he said, we'll make new ones. He appointed a new prefect of Palermo and gave him a clear mission. Mass raids and arrests began, often without trial or due process. Those who resisted were tortured. By 1929, Mafia groups in Sicily had been dismantled. Some of the bosses were imprisoned, others fled, many escaping to the United States. Mussolini celebrated what seemed like a total victory. But how did Cosa Nostra manage to rise again, stronger than ever? And how did the Americans end up teaming up with the Mafia to defeat fascism? Most believed that organized crime in Sicily was gone for good, but the Mafia hadn't disappeared. It had just gone underground, waiting for the right moment to return. And that moment, of course, would come. After fleeing to the United States, the leaders of the criminal gangs didn't abandon their operations. Instead, they re-established their networks, creating Italian-American enclaves based on the same family clan structures. During the Great Depression and the Prohibition era, the Italian Mafia in America regained its strength, diving into the underground production and distribution of alcohol. Smuggling and black market trade also became key sources of income. Needless to say, after the brutal events in Sicily, the Mafia held a deep hatred for fascism. Mussolini's repression had targeted not only criminals, but also innocent citizens. When World War II broke out, the Italian Mafia began reconnecting with underground resistance groups back in their homeland. There is a theory that in 1943, when American forces landed in Sicily, they did so with the help of the Sicilian Mafia. The U.S. government, fearing that post-fascist Europe might fall into communism, was determined to save Italy and saw the Mafia as a useful ally. For the Italian mob, this offered a golden opportunity to come out of hiding and reclaim lost power and prestige, so they helped the Americans. It's safe to say that Mussolini's harsh crackdown only temporarily weakened organized crime. It never eradicated it. The Mafia survived fascism and maintained its influence, and after forging ties with the United States, it came back even stronger. Legend has it that one day, Don Carlo, the underground boss of Sicily, drove openly into his hometown of Villalba in a military jeep, flanked by several American officers. Local gang members greeted him with cheers. From that moment on, Cosa Nostra began regaining its power, now not only as a criminal organization, but also as a political force, both in Italy and across the Atlantic. Over the following decades, Cosa Nostra rose to become one of the most powerful and notorious criminal syndicates, first in Italy, then across Europe. They infiltrated every corner of illegal enterprise, collaborating with other global crime networks. Their business thrived on human vices: drugs, human trafficking, illegal gambling, racketeering, fraud, prostitution, and pornography. The film trilogy The Godfather brilliantly portrayed mafia life during this period and became one of the most iconic cinematic works in history. But among all its illegal ventures, Cosa Nostra's most profitable operation remained cigarette smuggling. Mafia clans from Sicily and Naples struck a deal to jointly control tobacco distribution in Naples. By 1975, Cosa Nostra had set up numerous cigarette factories across Sicily, although in reality, many of them were used to process illegal narcotics. But was Cosa Nostra the only mafia in Italy? As we know, the original mafia brothers were three, and their legacy lived on in other crime families. These other syndicates certainly didn't disappear. In the 1970s and 80s, other powerful mafia groups still operated in Italy, namely the Camorra and 'Ndrangheta and Sacra Corona Unita. The Camorra had a rigid hierarchical structure and dealt mainly in illegal alcohol and tobacco, though on a smaller scale than Cosa Nostra. Still, by the early 80s, the police estimated the Camorra had around 7,000 active members collecting protection money all across Naples. Sacra Corona Unita was a branch of the Camorra, structured into 3 ranks. To move up, members had to undergo a baptism-like ritual. This group eventually dissolved in the early 2000s following major arrests. The 'Ndrangheta, based in the poor southern region of Calabria, wasn't as well known as Cosa Nostra or the Camorra. Initially, it lacked clear internal hierarchy and was based mostly on blood ties. Its members started off as highway robbers and bandits, later shifting to kidnapping for ransom. Yet somehow, this once small-time gang evolved into the most powerful criminal organization in Europe. But more on that later. By the 1970s, the Italian government finally decided to take a public stance against organized crime and began trying to sway public opinion. Instead of direct action, they relied mostly on media campaigns. TV and newspapers told the public that the mafia was a parasitic predator feeding off them for decades. Mafia leaders simply laughed at these efforts. By then, they had deeply embedded themselves in politics, law enforcement, and the judiciary. Some high-ranking officials not only ignored the mafia's actions, they openly collaborated with them. That's when television journalists decided to speak out. Remember the comparison to an octopus? That wasn't random. In 1984, a TV series called La Piovra, the Octopus, premiered and became an instant classic. Its protagonist, Commissioner Corrado Catani, was a brave and idealistic police officer who took on the mafia and the deeply corrupted system supporting it. The title said it all. The mafia's tentacles had wrapped around politics, banks, the military, the church, the media, and the courts. Catani quickly realized he wasn't just fighting a handful of criminals, but an entire hydra. The show depicted interrogations, betrayals, assassinations, blackmail, and the moral struggle of honest people in a dirty system. It was eerily prophetic. Real-life prosecutors and officers later admitted that La Piovra opened the public's eyes to the mafia's true nature. Catani's character wasn't just a fictional creation. He was inspired by a real-life hero, Giovanni Falcone, an honest and fearless prosecutor who fought the mafia through legal channels. By then, the public was fed up with living in fear and rallied behind Falcone. The criminals had become so brazen that they'd resorted to any method, often brutal and ruthless, to protect their power. Mafia bosses routinely ordered hits on judges, prosecutors, police officers, witnesses, and even their families. But then, a shift of power occurred within the mafia itself. Prosecutor Giovanni Falcone not only managed to arrest a high-ranking boss, he convinced him to break the code of silence, omerta. Falcone pushed through laws to protect witnesses and cooperating gang members. He also pioneered a system of total isolation for mafia leaders in prison, cutting off their communication with the outside world. This tactic disrupted the mafia's command structure and triggered a wave of arrests across Italy. In Palermo, a massive trial, known as the Maxi Trial, led to the conviction of 342 mobsters, with a combined sentence of over 2,600 years. Many top bosses received life sentences, but the mafia didn't back down. Anti-mafia judge Paolo Borsellino was assassinated, and Falcone himself survived several attempts on his life, until the last one proved fatal. In 1992, a bomb planted under the highway killed him. The murders of Falcone and Borsellino sent shockwaves through Italy and sparked national outrage. The public demanded justice, and Italy's interior ministry stepped in. What followed were dark days for the mafia. Law enforcement carried out sweeping arrests, not just of low-level enforcers, but of high-ranking crime bosses. Sicily's Cosa Nostra was hit especially hard, and by the late 90s, many of its leaders were behind bars. Their assets were seized and turned over to the state. In a symbolic move, the former home of the Sicilian Godfather in Palermo was converted into a police barracks, a clear message to anyone thinking of reviving the mafia, and maybe even a touch of mockery. Of course, the mafia wasn't eradicated entirely, but these actions severely weakened it. However, the fall of Cosa Nostra opened the door for other criminal syndicates. First came the Camorra, which initially controlled much of the Colombian drug trade into Italy. By the late 20th century, the Camorra had shifted its focus to counterfeit goods. They ran underground factories that produced fake luxury brand products. After a series of police raids, the organization suffered huge losses and began to disintegrate. Still, some Camorra members continue to live lavishly today, flaunting their wealth despite their humble working-class origins. Then there's the third major player, Calabria's 'Ndrangheta, a group that operated under the radar for years. By the early 2000s, as Cosa Nostra and the Camorra declined, the 'Ndrangheta stepped into the spotlight. With no serious rivals left, they rose to become the most powerful crime syndicate in Italy, and soon, all of Europe. Their influence extended far beyond Italy's borders, and they didn't hesitate to use brutal violence wherever necessary. Experts describe the 'Ndrangheta as one of Italy's most secretive and traditional organizations, more conservative even than the Catholic Church. But while the Church asks for devotion, the Calabrian Mafia demands obedience, often through force. For years, the 'Ndrangheta wasn't even officially labeled as a mafia. Its tight family-based structure made it look more like a private clan business. But times have changed. Today, not only Italian law enforcement, but even the FBI is pursuing them. In 2019, hundreds of arrests were made, including many individuals in powerful positions with ties to the group. The 'Ndrangheta's resilience is remarkable. Even during the COVID-19 pandemic, they found ways to profit from the crisis, adapting quickly to changing circumstances. Organized crime in Italy still exists today, and underestimating it would be a mistake. Many former mafia bosses who avoided prison have since legitimized their businesses, but few have truly abandoned criminal methods. Cosa Nostra is now weakened, but far from extinct. Instead of flashy murders and bombings, the mafia has adopted quieter, more sophisticated tactics. They infiltrate environmental and construction projects through shell companies, dominate the underground labor market, especially among migrants, and use modern technologies for communication and encryption. An interesting twist. A few years ago, traces of Cosa Nostra turned up in Russia. Russian gangsters connected to the Italian mafia were found to control most of Italy's farming and cargo transport operations, not just within the country, but across borders. This Russian criminal group reportedly had more than 300,000 members. As the saying goes, the mafia is immortal. Today, one of the most active groups is the Società Foggiana from Apulia, which became independent in the 1990s. It's known for its brutality, robberies, political corruption, and extortion of farmers. In 2021, the mayor of Foggia was arrested for mafia ties, and the city council was dissolved. In fact, since 2015, 4 such councils have been shut down in similar crackdowns. This group aggressively recruits teenagers, builds alliances with other mafia networks across Italy, and stands out for its deadly mix of democracy, violence, and strict family hierarchy. It's led by 4 main clans, the Aiemi, Morello, Londro, and Barillo families.